I asked what time we were leaving for the airport, and my son told me they were already in the Caribbean, so I transferred $250,000 out of his reach. The silence that followed those words cut through me like a cold knife. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd say out loud. And if you for 1 second feel like any of this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me to keep getting this off my chest. It was a Tuesday morning in Boston, and I was in my usual spot in the kitchen, my hands still damp from the coffee I'd just made, when my phone rang. The screen showed Michael's name, my son, and my heart sped up with that mix of excitement and anxiety only a mother can understand. We had been planning this trip for months. The Bahamas, his delayed honeymoon with Lauren, his wife of 2 years. I had insisted on going with them, not to intrude, but because I wanted to be part of their happiness. I had spent my retirement savings on those plane tickets, on that 5-star resort Lauren had picked after showing me hundreds of photos on Instagram. "This one is perfect, Carol," she had told me, with a smile I believed was genuine. "It's going to be amazing to be there together." My suitcase had been packed for 3 days. I had it sitting by the front door, like an excited old woman waiting for her first big adventure in years. I had bought a new dress at Nordstrom, the kind I never would have allowed myself when I was younger, because it cost nearly half of my monthly pension check. But this was special. It was a chance to make memories with my son and my daughter-in-law in paradise. "What time are we leaving for the airport, honey?" I asked, with that motherly voice that blends authority with affection. The silence on the other end of the line lasted an eternity. Then, that laugh. A laugh I didn't recognize, loaded with something that made me feel small before I even understood why. The airport. His tone was one of genuine surprise, as if I had asked something absurd. "Mom, we're already in the Bahamas. We left yesterday. Didn't Lauren tell you?" The phone nearly slipped from my hands. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, that my 72-year-old ears had played a trick on me. But in the background of the call, I could clearly hear the sound of waves, cheerful voices, tropical music, the clinking of glasses in a toast. It was real. They were there. Without me. We just came with our closest friends. I heard Lauren's voice in the distance, apparently speaking to someone else, but loud enough for me to hear. We didn't want any hassle. Our closest friends. I, who had held that boy in my arms when he cried at night, who had worked double shifts at the textile mill to pay for his college, who had sold my mother's jewelry to help him with the down payment on his condo, was not one of his closest people. My reflection in the kitchen window showed an old woman, her gray hair in a simple bun, wearing the same old bathrobe I wore every morning to make breakfast. But my eyes, the eyes that had watched my children be born, that had cried when my husband died 10 years ago, that had shone with pride every time Michael achieved something new, now looked empty, lost. "Was it a mistake?" I managed to ask, my voice a thread. "Did you forget to tell me?" Lauren's answer came after Michael handed her the phone. Her tone was condescending, as if she were talking to a child who doesn't understand why she can't go to the park. "Oh, Carol, don't take it like that. We just wanted to relax, no stress. Besides, you don't do well in hotels, do you? Remember how you complained about the air conditioning in Cape Cod last year? They treated me like a piece of old furniture that gets in the way of new decor, as if my age were a disability that embarrassed them. As if I hadn't been the one who paid every single dollar for that trip they were now enjoying without me. 3 years. 3 years of transferring money to Michael's account every time he called with an emergency. The down payment for the condo, the furniture for the wedding, Lauren's credit card debt, the new car, and now this. A Caribbean vacation that I financed but was excluded from as if I were an inconvenient stranger. I had sold the last of my family jewelry, used my retirement savings, and canceled the private health insurance I struggled so hard to maintain, all to help them build their future, as Michael used to say when he'd come over with that smile that melted my defenses and made me open my wallet one more time. Over $250,000 in 3 years. A fortune for a retiree living with a leaky roof in her North End apartment, and an oven that hadn't worked in 6 months. I hung up the phone and stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence that only those who live alone truly know. The suitcase by the door looked at me like a silent reproach. The new dress hanging in my closet had become evidence of my foolishness. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel something I had buried under layers of motherly love and sacrifice. Rage. A clean, crystal-clear rage that ran from my stomach to my fingertips. It wasn't just the money. It was the systematic humiliation disguised as family love. It was being turned into an emotional ATM that dispensed affection and cash on demand, but could be left behind when it was no longer convenient. That night, as I listened to the dripping from my ceiling and saw the pictures Lauren was posting on Instagram from a beach in the Bahamas, I made a decision that would change the rest of my life. The next day, I would go to the bank. And this time, it wouldn't be to transfer money. It would be to get my dignity back. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake remembering every dollar I had given, every sacrifice I had made, believing I was investing in my family's love. The moon filtered through the worn curtains of my bedroom as my mind traveled back years, untangling the web of manipulation that my life as a mother had become. It all started when Michael was 25 and came home with red eyes, smelling of alcohol, and holding an envelope. It was a court summons. He'd been in a car accident. Nothing serious, but the fine was $1,000. "Mom, if I don't pay this in a week, they'll suspend my license, and I can't work without my car," he had told me, sitting on the same couch where I now spent my afternoons watching soap operas to forget my loneliness. I remember counting and recounting my cash that night. I had exactly $1,200 saved after working extra shifts at the mill for 3 months. I was going to use it to fix the heating that had broken the previous winter. But my son's eyes, those eyes I had watched grow since he was a baby, were silently pleading with me. "Don't you worry, sweetheart," I told him, handing him the money. "That's what parents are for." He hugged me so tightly I thought he was truly grateful. "I'll pay you back as soon as I get paid next month, I promise," he whispered against my shoulder. That promise evaporated like the smoke from the cigarettes he smoked back then. He never mentioned the debt again, and I never reminded him because I thought it was my duty as a mother not to turn love into a business transaction. I spent that winter under 3 blankets, sleeping with wool socks and a hat because the heating remained broken. When Michael came to visit, he always found excuses not to stay long. "It's freezing in here, Mom. Why don't you buy a space heater?" As if I had money for such luxuries after saving him from losing his license. Then Lauren entered our lives like a perfumed hurricane. She was a girl from Wellesley, the daughter of merchants, used to a life Michael couldn't offer with his salary as an administrator at an insurance company. The first time he introduced her, I realized immediately she came from money. Her purse cost more than my monthly income, and she talked about restaurants I'd never been to and brands I only knew from window shopping. "Your mother is lovely," she told me that first time. But there was something in her smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was sizing me up the way you examine an antique piece of furniture, with superficial respect, but already deciding if it's worth keeping or better to get rid of. Michael changed after meeting her. He started to be ashamed of our neighborhood, of my small apartment, of the way I dressed. When he talked to me on the phone and she was there, his tone became different, colder, as if speaking affectionately to his mother was a weakness he couldn't afford to show. The first time he asked me for money to impress her was to take her to dinner at Number 9 Park. "It's her favorite restaurant, Mom. If I don't take her there, she'll think I'm a total deadbeat." $400 for one dinner. I was eating macaroni and jarred sauce 4 days a week to save money, but I took that money from my savings account because seeing my son in love filled me with a joy I thought was worth any sacrifice. Then came the engagement ring. Lauren had seen one in a jewelry store on Newberry Street that cost $7,500. "It's not that I'm materialistic, Carol," she explained to me during one of our few conversations alone, "but a woman only gets engaged once. I want something I can be proud to show my friends." Her friends, I later discovered, were all daughters of businessmen and professionals who were marrying men who earned 5 times what my Michael did. I sold the pearl necklace my mother had left me. It was the only valuable thing I owned, a memory from when we were a respectable middle-class family, before the 2008 crisis took my father's business and dragged us into financial hardship. The jeweler offered me $6,500, $1,000 less than I needed, but I had a bit more saved up in a cookie tin behind the flour in the kitchen. When Michael showed me the box with the ring and I saw how Lauren's eyes lit up, I thought I had made a good investment. She hugged me and called me the best mother-in-law in the world. That hug felt glorious, as if I had finally bought my place in their new, aspirational, upper-middle-class life. The wedding was the final blow to my finances. Lauren wanted an intimate but elegant ceremony at a historic inn in Newport. 150 guests, a seasonal menu, imported flowers, a professional photographer, a live band. "We only get married once," she repeated like a mantra every time the budget swelled a little more. Michael came to see me one night in March, 3 months before the wedding, with an expression I knew well. It was the same face he made as a child when he had broken something and knew he had to confess. He sat in my kitchen, in the same chair where he'd eaten breakfast for 18 years, and placed his hands on the table as if he were about to pray. "Mom, I need to ask you for something huge," he began, not looking me in the eye. "Lauren's dad was going to pay for half the wedding, but his business is going through a tough time. If we don't come up with $50,000, we'll have to cancel everything. Lauren is a wreck. She's been crying for 3 days straight. $50,000. An amount that, for me, represented 5 years of austere living, of counting every penny, of giving up any treat or comfort. But Lauren had been crying. My future daughter-in-law, who would soon give me grandchildren, who would become part of my family, was suffering. "So what are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You could take out a home equity loan on the apartment. You have good credit, and we'd pay you back in easy installments. It's just temporary, until I get a promotion or Lauren finds a job." Mortgaging my home, the only asset I had left from a lifetime of work, the only security I had for my old age. But Michael was looking at me with those eyes I'd known since he was born, and I couldn't say no. I signed the papers at the bank a week later. The manager, Mr. Davison, had known me for 20 years and looked at me with a mixture of concern and pity. "Carol, are you sure about this? It's a lot of money for someone on your pension." But I had already made my decision. I explained it was for my son's wedding, that it was an investment in our family's happiness. The wedding was indeed beautiful. Lauren was radiant in a dress that cost more than my annual pension, and Michael looked like the happiest man in the world. During the reception, several guests congratulated me on raising such a wonderful son. "You must be so proud," people told me. And I was. I felt useful, needed, important in my son's life. But when it came time for the family photos, something hurt in my chest. The photographer organized us into groups. First the bride and groom alone, then with her parents, then with some cousins and close friends. I appeared in exactly 3 of the 200 photos taken that night. In one, I was half hidden behind Lauren's sister, and in the other 2 I looked tired, with the forced smile of someone who knows they are there out of obligation more than love. That night, when I returned to my empty apartment, I sat on my couch and cried for the first time in years. Not tears of sadness, but of something more complex, the feeling of having paid a very high price for very little love. But I told myself it was normal to feel this way after such a milestone. My son now had his own family, and I had to learn to take a secondary role in his life. I didn't know the worst was yet to come, that every phone call would be a new opportunity to prove my love through my bank account, and that my place in the family would be proportional to my ability to finance their dreams. The payments for the home equity loan started the following month, $550 a month for 10 years. Half of my pension, every month, for a decade. But Michael had promised to help, and I trusted him to keep his word, as he had kept all the important promises in his life. That trust would cost me much more than money. It would cost me my dignity. Michael's promises evaporated as quickly as the love I thought I saw in his eyes on his wedding day. The first month after the ceremony, when the loan statement arrived, I called him, thinking it was a simple matter of collecting a legitimate debt. "Honey, the first loan payment is here. It's $550. "Oh, right, Mom. I'm a little tight this month with all the honeymoon expenses. Is it okay if I give you $200 and the rest next month?" $200. Less than half of what we agreed. But they had just come back from their trip, a trip I had, of course, also unknowingly financed. and I thought it was understandable they were short on cash. All right, sweetheart, but don't forget next month. The next month, the excuse was different. Lauren had lost her job, and they were living on just Michael's salary. The third, they had medical expenses because she needed fertility treatments. The fourth, their car had broken down, and they had to buy a new one. There was always a valid reason, always an emergency that justified me continuing to pay a debt we had taken on together, all by myself. And I, like the devoted mother I had been my whole life, found a way to cover their $550 every month while I ate rice and eggs and indefinitely postponed fixing the leaks that were turning my ceiling into a sieve. But the small humiliations hurt more than the money problems. Like the Sunday afternoon, I went to visit them at their new condo in Wellesley. Yes, they had moved to a nicer town without consulting me, and found the door locked at 3 p.m. I rang the bell several times. I knew they were home because I had seen Michael's car in the parking lot and could hear music from the street. Finally, Lauren opened the door in a bathrobe, looking annoyed. "Oh, Carol, didn't we say you were coming after 5? "No, sweetie. We agreed on 3. I even brought the coffee cake you asked for your friends. It's just that right now we're busy. Do you mind coming back later?" Busy. On a Sunday afternoon, in a home paid for with my money. They were too busy to receive the mother who was financing their lifestyle. I stood there in the hallway like an annoying salesperson, holding the cake I had baked with the most expensive ingredients I could afford, feeling small and disposable. "Okay," I murmured. "I'll call before I come back." "Perfect. You know how these couple things are?" No, I didn't know. Because when I was married to Michael's father, we would never have closed the door on our mothers for being busy on a Sunday afternoon. But apparently, I belonged to an outdated generation that didn't understand the modern codes of love and privacy. I went back to my apartment with the untouched coffee cake and ate it alone while watching an old movie on TV. It was one of those stories where families truly loved each other, where children cared for their elderly parents with genuine affection. It felt like science fiction. Months turned into years, and the dynamic became increasingly clear. I was useful when they needed money, invisible when they wanted privacy, and annoying when I sought affection without offering anything in return. My birthdays became last-minute celebrations when they remembered. Christmas turned into formal gatherings where I was the guest who was supposed to be grateful just for being included. The breaking point came the day I discovered, by chance, how much Michael was really earning. I had gone to the bank to make a transfer, another emergency that required my financial intervention, when Mr. Davison commented without malice, "Your son must be very happy with his promotion. With what he's making now, he could easily pay off that loan you're carrying." "Promotion?" I asked, feeling something uncomfortable churn in my stomach. "Yes, ma'am. He didn't tell you? He's been the regional assistant director for 6 months now. A huge salary, almost $9,000 a month. $9,000 a month. More than I had ever earned in my best years. And he was letting me pay $550 every month because he was supposedly tight on cash, while I was eating lentil soup 4 days a week and wearing 2 sweaters in the winter to save on heating. My son was earning a salary that allowed him to live comfortably and had chosen not to tell me so he could keep taking my money. I called him that night. Not to confront him, but to give him a chance to be honest with me. "Honey, how are things at work?" "Good, Mom. You know, same old. Can't complain." "No changes? No improvements?" "No, not really. Everything's the same. In fact, I don't think we're even getting a raise this year. Things are really tough. Lie after lie, delivered with the casualness of someone who has made deception a habit. My own son was looking me in the eyes and lying to me to continue stealing the money I needed to live with dignity in my old age. I hung up and sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had become my most frequent companion. For the first time in 3 years, I allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding. Was I really his mother, or just his bank account with feelings? The answer came in the cruelest way possible. A week later, Lauren posted a photo on Instagram from a 5-star restaurant in downtown Boston. The caption read, "Celebrating my love's promotion. We're finally upper middle class." They had spent more on that one dinner than I lived on for a month, celebrating a success they had deliberately hidden from me to continue exploiting my motherly love. The comments from her friends were like daggers. "You're so lucky. Now you can really have it all. It's about time you guys got some prosperity." Prosperity they had been enjoying for months while they let me pay their debts like an idiot. I stayed awake all night, not from the usual insomnia of my age, but from the rage burning inside me like a fire I had been unknowingly feeding for years. The next day, for the first time in my adult life, I made a decision thinking only of myself. I called the bank and made an appointment with Mr. Davison. It was time to find out exactly how much money I had lost financing the happiness of a couple who saw me as an inexhaustible resource instead of a human being who deserved respect. When I saw the figures printed on paper, the world reeled beneath my feet. It wasn't just the $50,000 for the wedding or the monthly payments I had been making alone for 3 years. It was dozens of smaller transfers, loans that were never repaid, emergencies that recurred with suspicious regularity. $257,000, almost everything I had saved in 40 years of honest work. Money I could have used to live with dignity, to fix my home, to travel, to enjoy a comfortable old age after decades of sacrifice. Instead, I had financed the lifestyle of 2 capable adults who had decided that stealing from an old woman was easier than working for what they wanted. And worst of all, they had done it with smiles, hugs, and words of affection that I now understood were as fake as the promises of repayment they never kept. Mr. Davison looked at me with the compassion of someone who had seen too many similar stories. "Carol, you're not alone in this, and you still have time to get your life back." Those words struck my heart like a revelation. Yes, I still had time. At 72, with my health deteriorating from stress and poor nutrition, my heart broken by the betrayal of my own blood, I still had time to reclaim my dignity. What Michael and Lauren didn't know was that they had awakened the woman who had been dormant for decades under the mask of the self-sacrificing mother. And that woman was very, very angry. Confirmation of my suspicions arrived exactly 2 days later, as if the universe had decided I had suffered enough passive humiliation, and it was time to show me the truth in all its starkness. Lauren called me with that syrupy voice she had perfected for extracting money, the same tone she used when she wanted to convince me that her whims were urgent needs. "Carol, sweetie," she began, and that affectionate diminutive sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "We forgot to tell you, the security deposit for the rent didn't go through on time. The landlord is furious and threatening to evict us if we don't pay today. Could you transfer $1,200? You know how these banking things are. Sometimes the auto payments fail. $1,200. More than half of my monthly pension. For people who made $9,000 a month and had just celebrated a promotion at a luxury restaurant." I was silent for a few seconds, feeling something definitively shatter in my chest. But it wasn't pain. It was liberation. "Carol, are you there? It's really urgent." "Yes, I'm here," I replied with a calmness that surprised me. "But you know what, Lauren? I only transfer money to my closest friends and family." I used her exact words from the Bahamas, the same words that had defined my place in their family hierarchy. Disposable, annoying, too old to be included in their moments of happiness. What do you mean?" "I mean I'm not transferring anything. You forgot to tell me a lot of things over the years, and now I'm going to start forgetting a few things myself." I hung up before she could respond. The phone was silent in my hand, and for the first time in years, that silence didn't scare me. It was the silence of a woman who had just found her voice again. It didn't take them an hour to start the harassment. First Lauren, crying on the phone as if she were the victim of a terrible injustice. Then Michael, with that mix of paternal authority and reproach he had perfected to make me feel guilty when I didn't do exactly what he wanted. "Mom, what's wrong with you? Lauren is hysterical. She said you hung up on her and said some weird things." I didn't say anything weird. I told her exactly what she told me from the Bahamas, that I only do things for my closest friends. That's ridiculous. Of course you're one of our closest. You're my mother. "Oh, really? Then why didn't you tell me you got a promotion? Why do you keep asking me for money when you make $9,000 a month? Why did you leave me out of the trip that I paid for?" Silence. For the first time in years, my son was speechless. I could hear his brain working frantically, searching for a convincing excuse. an explanation to justify 3 years of lies and manipulation. I don't know where you got that information, but it's wrong. And even if it were true, that doesn't give you the right to leave us hanging when we have a real emergency. A real emergency? Like the engagement ring? Like the wedding? Like all the loan payments I've made by myself for 3 years? Which one of those was a real emergency, Michael? You're acting crazy, Mom. This isn't like you. Crazy. The magic word manipulators use when their victims stop being docile. Crazy for refusing to continue being robbed. Crazy for demanding the basic respect I deserved after 40 years of honest work and 3 years of financing their life of lies. You're right, I told him with a surprising calm. This isn't like me. The normal me let myself be exploited, lied to, and humiliated without saying a word. But that normal is over. That night, while I ate an omelet that tasted glorious because I had cooked it without worrying about the cost of the eggs, I made the most important decision of my recent years. The next day, I would go to the bank, but not to transfer money. I would go to protect it. Mr. Davison greeted me with the sad smile of someone who knew my financial history better than I did. Carol, I imagine you're here about what happened yesterday. Your son has been calling all morning asking why a transfer wasn't processed. A transfer? I haven't authorized any transfer. Exactly. That's why we called you to confirm. He said it was a technical error, that you had already given the order over the phone. My own son had tried to steal from me directly, forging a transfer order. He wasn't even bothering to ask for the money with elaborate excuses anymore. He had decided to just take it, as if my bank account were an extension of his own. Mr. Davison, I said with a determination I didn't know I possessed, I want to change all the conditions on my accounts. I want no transfers to be made without my physical presence at the bank. I want any authorization I may have given in the past to be revoked. And I want a complete report of all transactions from the last 5 years. The manager looked at me with something that resembled pride. Of course, Carol. And if you'll permit a personal suggestion, we could also open a new, completely firewalled account for you to transfer your remaining savings into. An account that only you know about. When I left the bank that afternoon, I carried something more valuable than the money I had just protected. I carried the certainty that I could still make decisions, that my age didn't automatically make me a victim, that I deserved to live my final years with dignity instead of as an ATM for a family that had mistaken me for a renewable resource. The phone started ringing as soon as I got home. It was Michael, his voice unrecognizable. It was no longer the condescending tone of a son scolding his senile mother. It was the desperate voice of someone who had just lost his source of undeclared income. Mom, what did you do at the bank? I can't access the transfers. I protected what's left of my assets so I can afford to eat for the next few years. Eat? But we've never left you without enough to eat. Really? When was the last time you asked if I had enough money for groceries after I transferred you my pension? When was the last time you worried about whether I had heat in the winter or if I could afford to see a doctor? Silence again. Because the answer was never. He had never worried about my well-being after emptying my bank account. He had never thought of me as a human being with my own needs, only as an inexhaustible source of funds to finance the life they couldn't afford on their own. You can't do this, he finally mumbled. We're your family. No, I answered with a crystal clarity that shot through me like a bolt of lightning. Family takes care of each other. Family worries about the well-being of all its members. What you two have done to me these past few years hasn't been family. It's been parasitism disguised as love. That night, for the first time in 3 years, I let myself turn on the heat without calculating the cost. I made myself a decent dinner with ingredients that weren't on sale. I poured myself a glass of the wine I had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive. The special occasion was now. The day I got my self-respect back. The day I discovered that being a mother didn't mean being a slave, that loving a son didn't require financing his lies, and that at 72 I could still learn to say no. Outside, rain was falling on Boston. But for the first time in years, the leaks in my ceiling didn't bother me, because I had made a decision. The next day, I would start using my remaining savings to fix my own life, instead of financing the prosperity fantasies of 2 adults who had mistaken my love for their right to exploit me. The war had just begun, but I had already won the most important battle, the battle for my own dignity. The first response came at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. It wasn't a phone call or a text message. It was the insistent buzzing of my doorbell, pressed again and again with the urgency of someone who doesn't accept not being let in immediately. I looked through the peephole and saw Lauren standing in the hallway, her eyes swollen from crying, and a manila envelope in her hands. She was wearing that cashmere coat I had helped her buy last winter, when she convinced me she needed it for a job interview that turned out to be fake. $250 that came directly from my savings account to dress a woman who was now at my door, as if she were the victim in this situation. "Carol, please, open up. We need to talk." Her voice sounded broken, desperate, but it no longer triggered my automatic compassion. I had learned to distinguish between genuine pain and the emotional theater she had perfected to manipulate me for 3 years. I opened the door but left the security chain on. "What do you want, Lauren? Please let me in. This is important. It's about our future as a family." "Our future? Since when do we have a future together? As I recall, I'm not one of your closest friends." Her eyes filled with tears that seemed genuine, but I had seen that performance too many times. "Carol, the Bahamas was a misunderstanding. We were stressed. We weren't thinking straight. But you are family. You'll always be family." And what's in the envelope?" Lauren looked at the envelope as if she had just remembered she was holding it. It's just some papers. Nothing important. Just some legal things we need you to sign. For your own good. For my own good. The most dangerous words an elderly person can hear. Everything they had done to me over the years had supposedly been for my own good. The transfers to help them prosper so they could take better care of me in the future. The lies to avoid worrying me with their financial problems. The exclusion from the trip so I wouldn't get tired from all the activity. I'm not signing anything without reading it first. And I'm not reading it without a lawyer present. "A lawyer? Carol, we're family. Why do you need a lawyer to talk to us?" "Because family doesn't try to forge bank transfers." Her face fell. I had hit a nerve. She knew what Michael had tried to do the day before, and it had probably been her idea from the start. That was a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was attempted theft. And now you show up with papers you want me to sign without reading. What's in there, Lauren? A power of attorney? A transfer of assets? A declaration of mental incompetence? She fell silent, confirming my suspicions. The envelope held exactly what I feared. Documents to legally strip me of everything I had left. "Get out of my house," I said, with a firmness that surprised me. "And tell my son that if he wants to talk to me, he can come alone. No papers, no lawyers, no lies." Like the man I thought I had raised, I closed the door without waiting for an answer. From the other side, I could hear her trying to convince me for several more minutes, alternating between dramatic pleas and veiled threats about my mental state. Finally, silence returned to my apartment. That afternoon, as I was making a chamomile tea to calm my nerves, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I immediately recognized the voice on the other end. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Attorney Arce. I represent your son Michael in some legal matters. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your financial situation." A lawyer. They had hired a lawyer to force me to give them my money. The level of cold calculation this implied left me speechless for a few seconds. My financial situation? "Well, your son is concerned about some recent decisions you've made. Decisions that may not be in your best interest. We would like to help you protect your assets. Protect my assets from myself, only to hand them over to them." The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. "And how would you know about my financial decisions, counselor? Your son has informed us that you have been acting erratically, cutting off transfers that have been routine for years, suddenly changing the conditions of your bank accounts. This kind of behavior can be indicative of what? Of some form of cognitive decline that might require legal supervision." Cognitive decline. They wanted to declare me mentally incompetent so they could control my finances. The plan was perfect. An elderly woman who lives alone, who has been regularly transferring money for years, and suddenly refuses to do so. To a judge who didn't know the backstory, it could indeed look like the behavior of a person with dementia. "Mr. Arce," I said in the calmest voice I could muster, My mind is perfectly clear. Clear enough to understand that my son and his wife have been systematically stealing from me for 3 years, and clear enough to know that you are participating in an attempt at legal extortion. Mrs. Morrison, I believe you're misinterpreting. I'm not misinterpreting anything, and I suggest that before you proceed with any legal action, you thoroughly investigate the background of this case. Because I have documentation of every transfer, every lie, every manipulation, and I have witnesses. I hung up before he could reply. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was from pure, crystalline rage that gave me an energy I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't sleep that night. Not from anxiety, but because my mind was working at full speed, processing the magnitude of what I was facing. It wasn't just that my son and daughter-in-law were greedy. It was that they had systematically planned my financial ruin, and now, finding their illegitimate income stream cut off, they were willing to have me declared insane to regain access to my money. The next morning, I dialed the number of the only person I knew I could trust. Clara, my neighbor from the apartment next door. A retired nurse, a widow like me, with a daughter who visited her every Sunday and genuinely cared about her well-being. Clara, I need your help, I said when she opened the door. I think my family is trying to steal everything I have. Her expression immediately shifted from surprise to understanding. Carol, come in and tell me everything. For the next 2 hours, I recounted every detail of the last 3 years. The constant transfers, the lies about Michael's salary, the exclusion from the Bahamas trip, the attempted bank forgery, Lauren's visit with the papers, the lawyer's call. Clara listened in silence, nodding occasionally, taking notes in a small notebook she had taken from a drawer. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes, mentally organizing the information. Carol, she said finally, this isn't just financial abuse, it's systematic psychological abuse, and what they're trying now is legal fraud. But what can I do? I'm an old woman alone against a young couple with lawyers. You're not alone, she said with a firmness that immediately put me at ease. And you're not just an old woman. You're an intelligent woman who has identified a pattern of abuse and has taken steps to protect herself. That's not a symptom of dementia. It's a symptom of sanity. Clara knew a lawyer who specialized in elder law. Her name is Nidia Herrera. She's 70, has white hair, a voice of steel, and isn't intimidated by anyone. She's won cases worse than this. That afternoon, sitting in Ms. Herrera's office, surrounded by diplomas and law books, I felt for the first time in years like a person with rights instead of a helpless victim. Carol, she said after listening to my story, what they have done to you is a crime. Multiple crimes, in fact. And what they are trying to do now is even worse. But can I win? Win? She looked at me with a smile that was somewhat fierce. Carol, we're not just going to win. We're going to make them regret the day they decided to mistake a senior citizen for an easy target. For the first time in 3 years, I felt protected. Not by my family, which had turned out to be a collection of predators disguised as loved ones, but by women like me who had learned that age is not synonymous with vulnerability. The legal war was about to begin, but I was no longer alone in the trenches. Preparing for the legal battle gave me back a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I'd lost. Over the next few weeks, my apartment became an operations center where every document, every bank transfer, every text message was transformed into evidence of 3 years of systematic abuse. Ms. Herrera had been clear from day one. Carol, they are counting on you being ashamed of having been deceived, on you preferring to keep this private so you don't look like a foolish old woman. But the shame is not yours. The shame belongs to those who abused your trust. She was right. For years, I had kept quiet about the constant requests for money, because I was embarrassed to admit my own son was using me. I had rationalized every transfer, every lie, every humiliation because acknowledging the truth would have meant accepting that I had raised a predator. Clara became my most valuable ally. As a retired nurse, she had experience documenting abuse situations, and her methodology was flawless. We created a chronological file of every incident, from the first request for money to the most recent attempt to have me declared incompetent. Look at this, she said one afternoon, pointing to a pattern she had identified in the transfer dates. Every time you two had a conflict, he would wait exactly 2 weeks before asking you for money. Just enough time for you to feel guilty for being upset, but not so long that you'd forget the conflict. It was true. Michael had timed his requests with the precision of a manipulative psychologist. After every argument, every moment I had voiced a complaint about his behavior, the call would come with an emergency that required my immediate financial intervention. The pattern was so clear it was chilling. It hadn't been family love guiding our interactions all these years. It had been a calculated strategy of emotional extortion. As we gathered evidence, the attacks from Michael and Lauren intensified. They no longer bothered to maintain the pretense of family concern. The phone calls became threatening, the messages increasingly desperate. "Mom, you're destroying your own family," Michael would say in the voicemails he left when I didn't answer the phone. "Lauren can't sleep from worry. She's so stressed she's making herself sick." Is that what you want? For your daughter-in-law to end up in the hospital because of your selfishness? Selfishness. After 3 years of financing his wife's every whim, after mortgaging my future to pay for their wedding, after living like a pauper so they could maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford, my refusal to continue being robbed was selfishness. Lauren opted for a different strategy. Her messages were long, dramatic letters, full of references to the family we had been and the family we could be again if I would just come to my senses. "Carol, I know you're angry, and you have a right to be. We made mistakes. We admit that. But please, don't destroy everything we've built together. Remember when you told me I was like the daughter you never had? Remember how we cried together when you lost your sister? Remember all the Sundays we spent cooking in your kitchen, laughing at stories about Michael when he was little? Lies wrapped in real memories to confuse my perception of what had been genuine and what had been a performance. Because yes, we had shared those moments. But now I understood that for her, they had been emotional investments, ways to secure my loyalty for future financial withdrawals. The breaking point came when they decided to involve third parties in their pressure campaign. They started calling my acquaintances in the neighborhood, telling them I was losing it, and that they were worried about my well-being. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the corner bakery where I'd bought bread for 15 years, looked at me with pity when I went to get my usual loaf. "Carol, dear, how are you feeling? Your daughter-in-law stopped by yesterday and told me you've been a bit confused lately." "Confused?" "Yes, that you sometimes forget things, that you've been making strange decisions with your money." She said they're very worried. The humiliation of having to explain to my baker that I was not senile, that my son and his wife were waging a smear campaign against me to justify their attempts at theft, was one of the most degrading experiences of my life. But it was also liberating, because I realized I had nothing left to lose. If they were going to destroy my reputation in the neighborhood anyway, if they were going to paint me as a demented old woman who needed to be controlled by her family, then I could afford to fight back without restraint. Ms. Herrera had obtained a temporary restraining order that prevented Michael and Lauren from coming near my home or contacting me directly, but that didn't stop them. They just changed tactics. One morning, I found a woman waiting for me in the lobby of my building. She was in her 40s, with impeccable blonde hair, an expensive-looking suit, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Dr. Patricia Valls, a geriatric psychiatrist. Your family asked me to speak with you." A psychiatrist. They had hired a psychiatrist to declare me mentally incompetent. The level of resources they were investing in stripping me of my assets was astonishing. "I haven't requested a psychiatric consultation," I said with all the firmness I could muster. "I know, but sometimes family members notice changes that we don't perceive in ourselves. It would just be an informal chat to put your son's mind at ease." My son can put his mind at ease by returning the money he's stolen from me for the past 3 years. Her expression shifted slightly. She had expected to find a confused, malleable old woman, not someone who knew exactly what was happening. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand there are family tensions, but accusations of theft are very serious. Sometimes when we're under emotional stress, we can misinterpret normal situations of family support. Normal situations? Like forging bank transfers? Like trying to get me to sign power of attorney documents without reading them? Like publicly declaring that I have cognitive decline? Dr. Valls took notes in a folder she was carrying. Each of my coherent answers, each demonstration that my mind was working perfectly, seemed to frustrate her. Well, perhaps it would be better to talk in a more controlled environment. Would you be willing to come to my office? So you can declare me incompetent in an environment you control? No, thank you. I left her standing on the sidewalk and went up to my apartment, where I immediately called Ms. Herrera to inform her of this new manipulation attempt. "Carol, this is perfect," she said with a satisfaction I didn't expect. "They're so desperate they're making legal mistakes. A psychiatric evaluation without the patient's consent and without a court order is completely inadmissible in court. But can't it hurt my case that they've hired a psychiatrist? On the contrary, it shows premeditation. It shows they have carefully planned the process of declaring you incompetent to access your money. It's evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud." That night, as I reviewed all the documentation we had gathered one more time, I realized something that filled me with a strange sense of peace. For 72 years, I had lived trying to be what others expected of me: the obedient daughter, the devoted wife, the self-sacrificing mother. I had subordinated my needs, my desires, my own dignity to the service of maintaining family harmony. But now, for the first time in my adult life, I was fighting exclusively for myself, not to make anyone else happy, not to keep the peace, not to live up to social expectations of how an elderly woman should behave. I was fighting for my right to exist as an independent person, to control my own money, to make my own decisions without being punished by people who confused my love with their right to exploit me. And for the first time in decades, I felt completely alive. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week. It would be the moment to lay all the cards on the table, to prove before a judge that the only person in this story who had acted with sanity was the old woman everyone was trying to portray as demented. But before that, I had one last surprise in store for Michael and Lauren. A surprise that would show them that underestimating a senior citizen had been the costliest mistake of their lives. The surprise I had prepared for Michael and Lauren came in the form of a phone call from Phoenix, 3 days before the court hearing. It was Veronica, my daughter, who had left Boston 8 years ago after a terrible fight with her brother and me. A fight that now, with the perspective of time and experience, I understood completely differently. "Mom? It's Veronica." Her voice shot through me like a lightning bolt. We hadn't spoken in over 2 years. Not since that last tense conversation where she had accused me of always defending Michael, of never seeing his manipulations, of preferring a son who robbed me over a daughter who told me the truth. "Veronica, honey, I saw Lauren's posts on social media," she said without preamble. "She's saying you're having mental problems, that Michael is worried because you're making irrational decisions with your money, but something doesn't add up." Version. Of course, Lauren had taken her smear campaign to social media. She had probably posted dramatic messages about their family's concern, about the challenges of caring for an elderly mother who doesn't understand what she's doing, all designed to generate sympathy and support for her version of the story. What doesn't add up? Because if you were really losing your faculties, Lauren wouldn't be posting it on Facebook for the whole world to see. That's not what someone who is genuinely concerned about a sick relative does. That's what someone who is setting the stage to justify something does. My younger child had always been the more perceptive of the two. While Michael had inherited his father's superficial charm, Veronica had developed an emotional intelligence that made her a keen observer of human behavior. She was a psychologist, specializing in family therapy, and she had seen too many cases of abuse not to recognize the patterns. "Mom, can I ask you something? During these years we haven't spoken, how much money have you given Michael?" The number came out of my mouth like a confession. Over $250,000. Absolute silence on the other end of the line. Then, a deep sigh that contained years of confirmed frustrations. "I knew it," she murmured. "That's why we fought 8 years ago. Because I saw what he was doing and you refused to listen." The memories of that fight came back like an avalanche. Veronica had come home for Christmas with her husband, Daniel, and had witnessed one of Michael's typical emotional extortion sessions. That time, it had been for the down payment on a new car because his no longer projected the professional image he needed for his job. "Mom, don't you see what he's doing?" Veronica had asked after Michael left with the check in his pocket. He's using you like an ATM. Every time he comes here, it's to get money from you. Don't say that about your brother, I had replied, indignant, a mother who couldn't accept that one of her children was a predator. Michael is building his future. It's normal for him to need help. Help? Every month? For everything? Mom, he makes more than Daniel and I combined, but he lives like a millionaire because he knows you'll cover the difference. It had been a brutal argument that ended with Veronica storming out of the house on Christmas Eve, yelling that I preferred a son who stole my money over a daughter who told me the truth. At the time, I was convinced she was the one being unfair, envious, the one who didn't understand family bonds. Now I realized she had been the only person in my life who had the courage to tell me what I needed to hear. Veronica, I was wrong. You were right. Mom, don't call me to apologize. Call me because you need help, and I'm going to give it to you. Would you come to Boston? I know you have your life in Phoenix, your practice, your family. I already have the ticket. I'll be there tomorrow night. Daniel's staying with the kids. And Mom, I'm bringing reinforcements. The reinforcements turned out to be exactly what I needed. Veronica had contacted a network of professionals specializing in financial elder abuse cases. She wasn't just coming as my daughter, she was coming as an expert psychologist who understood the dynamics of family manipulation. When I saw her at Logan Airport, with her dark hair cut in a practical bob, and her eyes that were female versions of my own, I felt for the first time in years that I wasn't completely alone in the world. "Hi, Mom," she said, hugging me with an intensity that held 8 years of unsaid conversations. "I came to bring you home." Home? Home to yourself. To the woman you were before Michael convinced you that your only value was financing his life. During the drive to my apartment, I told her everything that had happened in recent months. The Bahamas trip I was excluded from, the revelation about Michael's promotion, the decision to cut off the transfers, the attempted bank forgery, the visit with the legal papers, the psychiatrist they had hired. Veronica listened in silence, but I could see her expression hardening with each new detail. When we got to my place and I showed her all the documentation Clara and I had compiled, her reaction was that of a professional who had just seen a textbook case. "Mom, this isn't just financial abuse. It's systematic psychological abuse with features of economic violence and aggravated emotional manipulation. I've seen similar cases in my practice, but rarely with this level of planning and cruelty. Do you think we can win in court? Win isn't the right word. We are going to destroy them legally, because they not only have to answer for the abuse, but for the attempt to have you declared incompetent to cover up their crimes." That night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in my apartment. Veronica slept on the couch, and her presence transformed the space. It was no longer the den of an isolated old woman, but the home of a woman who had someone on her side. "Mom," she said before turning off the light, "I want you to know something. When I left 8 years ago, I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I couldn't stand by and watch Michael destroy you bit by bit while you defended him. It was the hardest decision of my life. Why didn't you insist more? Why didn't you keep trying to make me see? Because I learned in my profession that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You had to get to this point on your own. You had to discover for yourself what Michael really was. If I had forced it on you, you would have just kept choosing him." She was right. If Veronica had insisted, if she had kept pressuring me to see the truth, I would have chosen to defend Michael and push her even further away. I had to hit rock bottom. I had to experience the most absolute betrayal, to be ready to accept reality. The next day, Veronica met with Ms. Herrera. It was a 3-hour conversation between professionals that resulted in a plan of action that gave me more confidence than I had felt since this whole nightmare began. "Carol," the lawyer told me after the meeting, "your daughter has not only confirmed that you are completely sane, but she has provided a psychological perspective that enormously strengthens our case. We are going to prove that what Michael and Lauren call cognitive decline is actually the awakening of a woman who was subjected to years of psychological conditioning for submission." What does that mean, exactly? It means we're not just going to win the case. We're going to set a precedent. We're going to prove that when an older woman says no for the first time in years, It's not a symptom of dementia. It's a symptom of freedom. The hearing was the next day. Veronica would stay with me through the entire process, not just as my daughter, but as my expert witness, testifying that the woman who had decided to defend her assets was the exact same intelligent and capable woman who had raised 2 children, held a job for 40 years, and survived widowhood with dignity. For the first time in months, I went to sleep feeling that the next day I wouldn't be fighting the world alone. I would be fighting alongside someone who knew me, understood me, and had staked her own professional reputation on proving I was right. The final battle was about to begin, but I was no longer a helpless old woman against a family of predators. I was a woman with allies, with evidence, and with the determination to reclaim not just my money, but my dignity. The day of the hearing dawned cold and gray in Boston, with that winter light that makes everything seem more serious, more final. I woke up at 6 in the morning, not from nervousness, but with the strange calm of someone who knows the moment of absolute truth has arrived. Veronica had helped me pick out my clothes the night before. My navy blue suit, the one I had worn for important occasions for years, but which now held a different meaning. It wasn't the uniform of an old woman begging for understanding, but the armor of a woman going to demand justice. "Mom," Veronica said as we had coffee and toast for breakfast, "I want you to remember something very important today. You're not there to convince anyone that you're a good mother or that you deserve love. You're there to prove that you are a citizen with rights that have been systematically violated." Clara had offered to come with us to the courthouse. "For moral support," she had said, but I knew it was also because she understood that this case wasn't just about me. It was about all the older women who had been treated as exploitable resources by families who mistook financial dependence for love. We arrived at the courthouse an hour before the hearing. Ms. Herrera was waiting for us on the steps, impeccable in her gray suit, with an expression that mixed professional confidence with something that looked like a personal thirst for justice. "Carol, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been waiting for this moment for years without knowing it." "Perfect. That's exactly the attitude we need." When we entered the courtroom, I saw Michael and Lauren sitting on the other side with Attorney Arce. My son was wearing his best suit, the one I had helped him buy for a job interview 2 years ago. Lauren was dressed in black, as if in mourning, with a victim's expression she had perfected over weeks of rehearsal. But what struck me most was seeing them together, whispering with their lawyer, reviewing papers, occasionally pointing at me as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than the woman who had given them life and supported them for years. In that moment, I confirmed something I had been denying for months. To them, I had never been a person. I had been a financial asset that had stopped being productive. The judge, Judge Thompson, was a man in his 60s with a tired look but alert eyes. He had seen, as Ms. Herrera had explained, hundreds of cases of family estate disputes, and he had a reputation for not being impressed by dramatic performances. "Good morning," he began in a firm voice. "We are here to resolve a petition for conservatorship filed by Mr. Michael Morrison against his mother, Mrs. Carol Morrison, for alleged cognitive decline affecting her ability to manage her financial affairs. We also have a countersuit for financial and psychological abuse filed by Mrs. Morrison. We will now hear the evidence." Attorney Arce stood up first, with that arrogant confidence of lawyers who believe they have the case won before it starts. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Mrs. Morrison has experienced evident cognitive decline, manifesting in irrational financial decisions and paranoid behavior toward her own family. For 3 years, she regularly transferred money to her son to assist with various family projects. Suddenly, without medical or rational explanation, she cut off all transfers and began making baseless accusations of theft and manipulation. He lied. He lied with the ease of someone who had rehearsed that version until it was memorized. He turned 3 years of emotional extortion into family assistance, and my awakening to reality into cognitive decline. Furthermore, he continued, Mrs. Morrison has refused to undergo psychiatric evaluations that could clarify her mental state, which is indicative of the loss of critical judgment characteristic of these degenerative processes. When he finished, Ms. Herrera stood up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your Honor, the defense will prove that the only thing that has declined in this case is Mrs. Morrison's patience for continuing to be a victim of systematic financial abuse. We will present documentary evidence that for 3 years, the petitioner and his wife extracted over $250,000 from Mrs. Morrison's accounts through lies, emotional manipulation, and attempted bank forgery. Furthermore, she added with an intensity that made the entire room pay attention, we will show that when Mrs. Morrison finally took measures to protect her remaining assets, the petitioners launched a public smear campaign and psychological pressure designed to have her declared incompetent and regain access to her money. The first witness was Mr. Davison, the bank manager. With the precision of someone who had spent decades handling other people's money, he explained to the judge the pattern of transfers he had observed over the last 3 years. The transfers were regular, always for significant amounts, always authorized by Mrs. Morrison in person. But in my 40 years of banking, I had never seen a retiree systematically transfer such large sums from her pension, while her own standard of living visibly deteriorated. What do you mean her standard of living deteriorated? Mrs. Morrison stopped using banking services she had maintained for years, like her safe deposit box. She canceled conservative investment products that gave her additional returns. She began withdrawing cash in very small amounts, typical of someone counting every dollar. And yet, she continued to transfer large sums to her son. Exactly. The pattern was that of someone impoverishing herself to enrich others. Then came Clara's testimony. As a retired nurse, she had the authority to speak about the mental state of older adults. Mrs. Morrison shows no symptoms of cognitive decline, she declared with professional firmness. Her memory is intact, her reasoning is clear, her orientation to time and place is perfect. What I have observed are symptoms of chronic stress, consistent with prolonged psychological abuse. Can you explain that difference? A person with dementia shows confusion about basic facts, recent memory loss, difficulty performing daily tasks. Mrs. Morrison remembers every transfer, every date, every amount. Her decision to protect her assets is not a symptom of confusion, but of recovered mental clarity. The most powerful moment came when Veronica took the stand as an expert witness. She presented herself to the judge not just as the defendant's daughter, but as a psychologist specializing in intrafamily violence. Your Honor, as a professional, I have treated dozens of cases of financial elder abuse. The pattern in this case is a textbook example of psychological conditioning for economic submission. She explained in technical but understandable terms how Michael had used emotional manipulation techniques to create psychological dependence, how he had timed his request to maximize maternal guilt, how he had gradually isolated Carol from other sources of emotional support. The fact that my mother decided to protect her assets after discovering the lies about my brother's income is not a symptom of cognitive decline. It is evidence that her capacity for analysis and self-protection is intact. And the unsolicited psychiatric evaluation attempt? It's a common tactic in these cases. When the financial abuse is cut off, the perpetrators try to discredit the victim's mental competence to justify their past actions and regain access to the resources. But the final blow came when Ms. Herrera presented the recordings. For weeks, following her advice, I had recorded all phone conversations with Michael and Lauren. The judge listened in silence as my own children's voices filled the room. If you don't give us the money, Mom, we're going to have to take legal action. You're acting crazy. This isn't like you. The doctor says this behavior is typical of people who are starting to lose their faculties. We just want to protect you from yourself. Every sentence was a confession of manipulation. Every veiled threat was evidence of the coordinated campaign to discredit my mental competence. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he was visibly nervous. His arrogant confidence had evaporated under the weight of the evidence. Mr. Morrison, Ms. Herrera asked, "Is it true that you earn nearly $9,000 a month?" "Yes, but is it true that for 3 years you allowed your mother, a retiree on a small pension, to pay $550 a month on a loan taken out to finance your wedding? She wanted to help? Is it true that you attempted to authorize a bank transfer without your mother's knowledge?" It was a misunderstanding. Is it true that you hired a psychiatrist to evaluate your mother without her consent? We were worried. Each answer sank him deeper into his own web of lies. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When he returned, his expression was severe. After reviewing all the evidence presented, this court finds that Mrs. Carol Morrison is in full command of her mental faculties and that her recent financial decisions are rational and justified. Furthermore, he continued with a harshness that surprised me, this court finds substantial evidence of financial and psychological abuse by the petitioners against Mrs. Morrison. Therefore, the petition for conservatorship is denied, and Mr. Michael Morrison and Mrs. Lauren Morrison are ordered to cease all contact with the defendant, except through legal representation. Finally, this court orders a criminal investigation for the felonies of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. I walked out of the courthouse on Veronica's arm, with Clara on my other side, and Ms. Herrera smiling with the satisfaction of a job well done. I had won more than a court case. I had won back my dignity, my autonomy, and the certainty that I deserved respect regardless of my age. For the first time in years, I was completely free. The days following the verdict were strange, like waking from a very long dream and not immediately recognizing the real world. For the first time in years, my phone didn't ring with desperate pleas for money. My bank account remained untouched from one day to the next. No one called to explain why my refusal to transfer money was a symptom of senile dementia. The silence was intoxicating. Veronica stayed with me for a week after the ruling, helping me process not just the legal victory, but the emotional transformation I had undergone. It was as if I had been living underwater for 3 years and had finally broken the surface to breathe fresh air. "Mom," she said one afternoon as we had tea in my kitchen, "do you realize what you've done? You didn't just stand up to Michael and Lauren. You stood up to 40 years of social conditioning that taught you that a woman's worth, especially an older woman's, depends on her usefulness to others." She was right. For decades, I had measured my self-esteem by how much others needed me. First, my husband, who had depended on me for everything domestic while he focused on important things. Then my children, especially Michael, who had learned from a young age that Mom would always find a way to fix his problems. Finally, Lauren, who had immediately identified my need to be useful and had exploited it with surgical precision. "You know what's strangest?" I told Veronica. "I don't miss the calls asking for money. I miss the feeling of being needed. But you are still needed, Mom. Except now you're needed by yourself." That sentence stayed with me for days. Needed by myself. When was the last time I had done something just because I wanted to, without considering if it would make someone else happy, without calculating if it would make me look like a good mother, a good mother-in-law, a good person? The answer was terrifying. I couldn't remember. 2 weeks after the trial, I made my first completely selfish decision in decades. I went to a travel agency on Boylston Street and bought a ticket to Bar Harbor, to the coast of Maine where I had spent my best childhood vacations with my parents. The young woman at the agency, with a nose ring and a genuine smile, asked me, "Is this a family trip?" "No," I replied with a sense of liberation that surprised me. "It's a trip for me. How many nights?" "As many as I want." I booked a room in a hotel facing the ocean, with a view of the Atlantic, for an indefinite period. When she asked for a departure date, I told her I would confirm it later. It was the first time in my adult life I had made plans without knowing exactly when they would end, without being limited by someone else's budget, without having to justify the expense to anyone. The train ride to Maine was a revelation. For hours, I watched the New England landscape shift from cityscape to the green, rocky coast, and for the first time in years, I thought of nothing but what I saw out the window. I didn't calculate how much the ticket was costing me. I didn't worry if someone needed me in Boston. I didn't feel guilty for spending money on my own pleasure. The hotel was modest but clean, with a balcony that looked directly out onto the ocean. When I opened the curtains that first morning and saw the sea stretching to the horizon, I started to cry. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something I took a moment to identify. It was relief. A relief so profound it was physically painful. I had spent 72 years caring for others, worrying about others, living for others. And suddenly, I was alone in a hotel room, with no more responsibility, than deciding whether I wanted to have breakfast on the terrace or go down to the restaurant. I chose the terrace. The first few days were pure sensory indulgence. I walked along the beach with no destination, feeling the sand between my toes as I hadn't since childhood. I ate in small restaurants where no one knew me, where I could order exactly what I craved without thinking about a family budget. I bought a book in a downtown shop and read the whole thing in one afternoon, sitting on a park bench with no interruptions from phones demanding favors. But the most revealing thing happened on the third night. I was having dinner alone in a restaurant with a view of the harbor when a couple my age sat down at the next table. The woman, elegant and well-dressed, constantly scolded her husband for everything, for how he held his fork, for the wine he had chosen, for talking too loudly. The man nodded at everything with the resignation of someone who had learned it was easier to agree than to argue. They reminded me of my parents in their later years, when exhaustion and habit had turned their marriage into a series of small, mutual tyrannies. They reminded me of myself with my husband, always correcting, always improving, always trying to mold him into the version of himself I thought he should be. And I realized something that took my breath away. I had reproduced that pattern with Michael. For years, I had justified his demands for money because I believed it was my responsibility to help him be better. I had financed his whims because I thought it was my motherly duty to support his dreams. I had accepted his lies because I believed it was my role to understand his struggles. In reality, I had been controlling his life just as much as he had been controlling mine. The difference was that he had learned to turn my control into financial gain, while I had paid for the privilege of being manipulated. That revelation freed me from the last shred of guilt I felt for losing him. I hadn't lost a son. I had stopped being an accomplice to a parasite. From that night on, my stay in Maine changed. It stopped being an escape from Boston and became a rediscovery of who I was when no one else depended on me. I started doing things I had put off for decades. I signed up for a watercolor class offered at the local community center. My first attempts were disastrous, but for the first time in years, I didn't care about being bad at something. There was no one to impress. No one who depended on my competence. No one whose opinion I had to consider more important than my own enjoyment. I also started writing. Nothing ambitious, just a journal where I recorded my thoughts, my observations, my plans. Writing about my experience with Michael and Lauren helped me process it objectively, as if I were telling someone else's story. From that emotional distance, the pattern of abuse was so clear that I wondered how I could have been blind to it for so long. The answer I understood after several weeks of reflection was that I had confused love with sacrifice. I had believed that loving someone meant being willing to give everything for them, even if that person didn't reciprocate with the same level of care and consideration. But true love, I realized, requires mutual respect. And respect includes recognizing the other's boundaries, valuing their well-being, caring about their dignity. Michael and Lauren had never shown concern for my financial well-being, never valued my dignity, and never respected my boundaries because I had never set any. One afternoon, while painting a particularly ugly but deeply satisfying seascape, I got a call from Veronica. "Mom, how are you? I haven't heard from you in a week." "I'm fine," I said, and it was the first time in years that answer was completely honest. "I'm learning how to be fine. Are you thinking of coming back to Boston soon?" "When I'm ready. For the first time in my life, I have unlimited time and enough money to do exactly what I want. I'm not going to waste this opportunity." Veronica laughed, and I could hear the pride in her voice. "I'm so glad to hear you like this. You sound like yourself." When I hung up, I thought about that phrase. I sounded like myself. But who was myself after 72 years of being primarily an extension of other people? The answer came gradually, day by day, decision by decision. I was the woman who chose the colors for her watercolors without asking for anyone's opinion. I was the woman who woke up when her body was rested, not when others needed her to be available. I was the woman who spent her money on experiences that made her happy, without feeling guilty for not financing others' dreams. I was the woman who had been dormant for decades under the social expectations of motherhood, marriage, and aging. And that woman, I discovered with surprise and joy, was extraordinarily interesting. After 6 weeks in Maine, I knew it was time to go back to Boston. Not because I missed my old life, but because I had found the strength to build a new one in the place where I had lost the old one. As the train pulled into South Station, I was carrying more than just suitcases. I was carrying the certainty that I deserved respect, the experience of living for myself, and the plans for an old age that would be mine in every sense of the word. The apartment greeted me like a completely new space, full of possibilities I hadn't been able to see before. Back in Boston, my apartment seemed smaller, but also more my own. The ceiling leaks, which for years had been symbols of my inability to afford basic repairs, now just looked like a problem I had both the right and the resources to fix. The first call I made was to a plumber, the second to a painter, the third to a deep cleaning service. For years, I had lived in a deteriorating space because every available dollar was earmarked to finance Michael and Lauren's prosperity fantasies. Now, for the first time since I retired, I was going to invest money in my own well-being. "When could you start?" I asked the plumber when he came to give me an estimate. "Next week, ma'am." "Perfect. And while you're at it, could you check all the plumbing? I want to make sure there are no more surprises." It was liberating to say that sentence without mentally calculating if I could afford it. Of course I could. I had money in the bank because I had finally stopped giving it to thieves disguised as family. While I waited for the work to begin, I decided to do something I had been putting off for months: go through all my belongings and get rid of everything that connected me to the victim version of myself. I started with my closet. The clothes I had worn during the years of financial abuse now seemed imbued with an energy of resignation I no longer wanted to carry. The dresses I wore for the rare family visits, where I tried hard to look prosperous so Michael wouldn't feel bad about stealing from me. The old sweaters I wore at home because I had normalized living in precarity while financing someone else's luxury. The worn-out shoes I hadn't replaced because, what's the point? I don't go out anywhere. All of it went into bags for donation. In its place, I went shopping for the first time in years without anxiously looking at the price tags. I didn't buy expensive or extravagant clothes, but I bought clothes I liked, that fit me well, that made me feel like the woman I was now instead of the victim I had been. The most dramatic change came when I decided to redecorate the house. For years, I had lived surrounded by cheap furniture bought in a hurry when I moved after my husband died, because all the good money had to be saved for Michael's constant emergencies. Now I could afford to replace the worn-out couch where I had spent so many nights worrying about the family finances. I replaced the kitchen table where I had counted and recounted my bills before every transfer. I bought new art to replace the family photos that reminded me of times when I confused exploitation with love. Every change in the apartment was also a change in my identity. I was creating a space that reflected who I was now, not who I had been when I let others define my worth. The most significant transformation came when Clara invited me to a support group meeting for older women who had experienced family financial abuse. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she explained. "But I think it would help you to hear other stories, and maybe your story can help others." The group met at the neighborhood community center, in a small room with circles of folding chairs and a half-working coffee pot. There were 8 other women besides me, all between 60 and 80, all with that particular expression people develop after surviving family betrayals. The facilitator's name was Carmen, a social worker specializing in elder abuse. "There's no judgment here," she explained when she introduced me to the group. "We've all learned that family love can be a tool for manipulation when it's not accompanied by respect." One by one, the women shared their stories. Rose had financed her son-in-law's failed business for 10 years, losing her house in the process. Paula had been convinced by her 3 children to sell her condo to invest in a real estate project that turned out to be fake. Martha had co-signed for her grandchildren's student loans, not knowing the kids had dropped out of college and were using the money for other things. Each story was a variation on the same theme: older women whose love had been monetized by relatives who saw maternal generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift to be honored. "What hurts the most," Martha said, drying her eyes with a tissue, "isn't the lost money. It's discovering that my own grandchildren saw me as a source of income instead of their grandmother." When it was my turn to speak, something I hadn't planned on doing, the words came out with a surprising clarity. For 3 years, I financed the lives of my son and his wife, believing I was investing in their happiness. What I was really buying was my own emotional slavery. Every transfer was another link in a chain that tied me to people who had learned to confuse my love with their right to exploit me. "How did you manage to break free?" Rose asked. I stopped being afraid that they would stop loving me, because I realized they had never truly loved me. They loved my money, my availability, my inability to say no, but they had never known me, the person with her own needs and boundaries. After the meeting, Carmen asked me to stay for a few minutes. "Carol, have you ever considered using your experience to help other women? Your case got a lot of visibility because of the trial, and I think your story could prevent others from going through the same thing." "What kind of help?" "Talks at community centers, collaborating with social services, maybe even volunteering with organizations that protect seniors. You have something that many victims need to see, proof that it's possible to recover, that it's not too late to reclaim your life." The idea intrigued me. For 72 years, I had defined my purpose by what others needed from me. But now I could choose to use my experience to help from a position of strength instead of weakness, to prevent suffering instead of financing someone else's whims. "Give me some time to think about it," I told her. That night, eating dinner at my new table in my renovated apartment, I reflected on Carmen's proposal. There was something deeply appealing about the idea of turning my pain into purpose, my experience into wisdom that could help others. But there was also something more important. For the first time in my life, I had the luxury of choosing how to use my time and energy, based solely on what I found valuable, not on what others expected of me. 2 days later, I called Carmen. "I'll do it," I said, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "This has to be a volunteer position that I can leave whenever I want, without guilt and without explanation. I've spent too many years fulfilling obligations others created for me. Any new commitment has to be completely on my terms." Carmen laughed. "Carol, I think you're going to be exactly the kind of mentor these women need." A week later, I gave my first talk at a senior day center in Jamaica Plain. There were 20 women in the audience, some accompanied by daughters or granddaughters who had identified worrying patterns in their own families. I told my story without dramatizing or downplaying it. I explained how I had gradually gone from a protective mother to a victim of financial abuse, how I had rationalized every transfer, every lie, every humiliation. But most of all, I talked about how I had reclaimed my dignity and my autonomy. "The question you need to ask yourselves," I told them at the end, "is not whether your families love you. The question is whether they respect you. Because love without respect isn't love. It's exploitation disguised as affection." A woman in her 80s raised her hand. "But what if, by saying no, we end up completely alone? Then you find out if you were ever truly with someone, or if you were just being used. And believe me, it is better to be alone with dignity than to be accompanied by parasites." When the talk was over, 3 women approached me for information on lawyers specializing in financial abuse. 2 others wanted to know how to talk to their families about financial boundaries. A frail-looking old woman took my hand and said, "Thank you for showing me I'm not too old to stand up for my rights." Driving home that afternoon, I realized I had found something I didn't know I was looking for, a way to use my experience that gave me purpose without sacrificing my autonomy, a way to help others that strengthened me instead of draining me. For the first time in 72 years, I had found the perfect balance between being useful to others and being true to myself. And that night, in my renovated apartment, with my bank account protected and my dignity intact, I slept with the deep satisfaction of knowing that the rest of my life belonged completely to me.